I first saw her in the hallway, leaning just slightly against the worn wooden doorframe, and for a moment, the world shrank to the space between us. She had this quiet command of the air, like she'd claimed it without needing anyone's permission, and yet there was something fragile beneath the surface, a flicker in her eyes, almost invisible, like she expected it to be noticed. I did. Her name was Eleanor. Graceful, mid-40s, the kind of woman who carried her confidence like a second skin but never shouted it. Every line on her face felt deliberate, like a story she didn't yet trust anyone to read aloud. I, on the other hand, was young enough to stumble over my own thoughts, always noticing the small things, the way her hair fell over her shoulder when she tilted her head, the soft hum of her laughter when she thought no one was listening. That day, the room was quiet except for the low creak of the radiator. Afternoon sunlight spilled across the faded carpet, brushing her shoes in golden warmth. I was pretending to arrange some papers, though I hardly knew what I was doing. She walked toward me slowly, and I felt the shift in the air, a subtle tension, like the seconds before a keynote in a song. Our hands brushed. Just a fraction, a fleeting contact, but it felt heavy, charged. My fingers lingered against her wrist, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she glanced down at me with that faint, knowing smile that made my chest tighten. I wanted to say something clever, something that would matter, but all I could do was meet her eyes and let the silence stretch. She had a habit of tilting her chin slightly when she was curious, and right then, she tilted it toward me. I thought I saw a shadow of amusement, maybe a hint of challenge. My pulse picked up. Every small motion, the brush of her sleeve against mine, the tilt of her body, the warmth radiating from her presence, was a conversation I couldn't fully read. I felt both exposed and invisible at the same time. The coffee on the table steamed lazily, a faint scent of cream and roasted beans curling into the room. I noticed the slight crease at the corner of her mouth when she laughed at something I didn't even realize I said. She leaned a little closer, and I could feel the subtle heat of her proximity, the easy elegance of her posture, the quiet gravity pulling me in. Time slowed, or maybe it just felt that way, and I realized I was memorizing her. The curve of her shoulder under the sleeve of her blouse, the way her eyes lingered just long enough to make me question whether she intended it or not. My own hands fumbled with the papers, almost forgetting their purpose, distracted entirely by the rhythm of her breathing, the soft cadence of her voice, the tension vibrating between us like an unspoken promise. I wanted to reach for her, to trace a line from her hand to her face, but something, the unspoken rules, the invisible distance between us, kept me frozen. She noticed, I think, because her gaze softened for the briefest instant, as though acknowledging that she knew what I was feeling without a word being exchanged. And then, just as the air between us thickened into something almost unbearable, the door opened. A sudden click, the scraping of feet in the hallway, and the world shifted back into its normal pace. Eleanor's head turned sharply, her expression flashing in an instant between annoyance and something I couldn't name. My heart thumped so loud I was certain she could hear it. I didn't move. She didn't move. And in that charged, suspended moment, I realized, whatever game this was, whatever silent tug-of-war had started, nothing about it would ever be simple. I couldn't stop thinking about that moment, though the hallway was empty now. Eleanor had returned to her desk, pretending to sort papers, but I noticed the slight slump of her shoulders, the way her fingers drummed lightly on the surface as if she were arguing with herself. There was a story in her posture, one she didn't tell anyone, and I felt, for some irrational reason, that I was supposed to understand it. She'd told me, once in passing, that her last relationship had ended quietly, a marriage that unraveled before anyone noticed, leaving behind a kind of loneliness that wasn't loud but persistent. She didn't complain, she didn't look bitter. But I caught the glimmer of something in her eyes whenever she thought no one was watching. A quiet ache. And now, standing near her, I wondered if she felt it still, or if she had built walls thick enough that no one, not even me, could breach. I had my own hesitations, though they felt childish compared to hers. She was Eleanor, assured, measured, someone who knew exactly how to inhabit a room. And me? I was a young man still discovering the weight of my own gaze, feeling suddenly exposed in the quiet pull between us. There was an unspoken risk in noticing her, socially, morally, emotionally. People would whisper, assumptions would form. But the thought didn't scare me. The thought made the room warmer. I caught her glancing at me from the corner of her eye, the tiniest tilt of her head betraying her curiosity, and I quickly looked away. But her presence lingered. The subtle warmth as she brushed past me to reach the printer, her sleeve grazing my arm, left a spark I couldn't ignore. I felt it in my chest, a mix of longing and caution, as though the air between us were charged with something both dangerous and inevitable. She leaned closer when she handed me a file, her breath brushing my ear as she whispered instructions I barely heard. The nearness made my pulse jitter, and I found myself struggling to meet her eyes, not because I was embarrassed, but because I didn't want to betray the way her nearness unspooled all my careful composure. She lingered, just a fraction longer than necessary, and then stepped back, as if testing boundaries, hers and mine. There was history in every hesitation. Hers shaped by loss and prudence, mine by inexperience and desire. And yet, in that careful dance of proximity and withdrawal, something fragile began to form, a thread we both sensed but neither dared pull. I noticed the faint smile she offered, almost invisible, just a twitch of the lips, and I felt a tremor of connection. I wanted to reach out, to let my hand brush hers again, but instead I held it at my side, knowing that sometimes restraint could speak louder than action. She noticed my pause, I could tell, because her gaze softened, a silent acknowledgement, a shared understanding without words. And then, just as the room seemed to hold its breath, the phone rang, startling us both. She glanced at it, a flicker of frustration crossing her face, and I realized, whatever delicate momentum we'd built, the world was waiting to interrupt. But for one heartbeat, one tiny, suspended heartbeat, it had been ours. The office felt smaller that afternoon, though it hadn't changed. It was just us, or so I thought, until a sudden knock at the door made us both stiffen. Eleanor's head snapped toward it, and I realized how close we'd been standing, too close. My shoulder brushed hers, accidental and electric, and she didn't pull away immediately. "Just a minute," she said, voice steady but low, as if willing the interruption to vanish. I could feel her breath against my neck, faint and warm, and my pulse quickened without permission. The knock came again, impatient. She pressed a finger to her lips, a silent warning, and I understood instantly, we weren't supposed to be noticed. The door swung open just slightly, a shadow in the frame, and we froze. I felt like a child caught in the wrong moment, though the ache in my chest said otherwise. Eleanor's hand lingered near mine, not touching, just hovering, a tease and a tether all at once. The visitor, some intern, or maybe a colleague, muted their curiosity with a shrug and left, closing the door slowly behind them. We exhaled almost simultaneously, the tension not dissipating but thickening. I wanted to laugh, or apologize, or make some stupid comment to break the spell, but instead I stayed silent, letting the space between us crackle. Her eyes found mine, and in them I saw a mirrored restraint, desire mingled with caution. She stepped closer again, the subtle sway of her body brushing mine, and I felt a pull I couldn't name. Our proximity was hypnotic. I wanted to lean in, to close the infinitesimal distance between us, but the moment balanced precariously on the edge of something forbidden. Instead, I let my hand hover near hers, feeling the warmth through the air, imagining what it would feel like if our fingers actually touched. "Do you need help with this?" I asked, my voice uneven, betraying the tight coil of awareness in my chest. Her gaze dropped, and for a heartbeat, I thought she might reach for me, might let the impulse override the caution. But then she straightened, ever graceful, ever deliberate, and whispered, "No. I've got it." Yet she didn't step back, didn't remove the unspoken thread tying us together. The room seemed to shrink again, filled with the sound of our heartbeat echoes and the soft scrape of her shoes on the carpet. I noticed every detail, the faint scent of her perfume, the trembling of her hands as she adjusted the papers, the way her lips parted just slightly when she exhaled. My own restraint felt fragile, almost laughably inadequate against the gravity between us. We lingered in silence, drawn closer despite our best intentions. Her shoulder pressed lightly against mine as we both bent over the same folder, a near confession of proximity, an accidental intimacy that neither of us could fully claim or escape. And then, when I dared to glance up, her eyes caught mine, sharp, piercing, holding both warning and invitation. We were closer than ever, the air thick with what wasn't said, and yet both of us knew, the moment wasn't ours to finish. But it lingered anyway, like a pulse in the quiet, leaving me breathless and desperate for more. The office was quiet again, but this time the quiet felt heavier, almost unbearable. Eleanor was at her desk, But she wasn't really there. I could see it in the way her shoulders slumped slightly, the way she tapped her fingers against the wood as if to distract herself from something she couldn't name. I wanted to reach out, to steady her somehow, but fear kept my hand at my side. Fear, and the thrill that it was entirely impossible. "You're quiet today," she said, her voice soft but pointed. Not teasing, not casual, deliberate, as though she were testing me. I tried to answer, and the words caught in my throat. "How do you explain that your heart is hammering because someone simply exists near you?" She leaned slightly toward me, and the faint scent of her perfume hit me, warm and familiar. I wanted to inhale it deeply, wanted to close the infinitesimal distance between us, but restraint was a cruel teacher. I found myself imagining tracing the line of her jaw, brushing the hair from her face, feeling her shoulder press against mine just as it had that day with the papers. My breath hitched, almost louder than I realized. I started, then stopped. My tongue felt heavy, my words inadequate. She tilted her head, giving me a look that was half patience, half challenge. The corners of her lips quirked in a faint, almost imperceptible smile. The desire to reach out consumed me, pushing past reason. I stepped closer, feeling the warmth radiate from her, the subtle brush of her sleeve against mine, the tension in her posture matching mine perfectly. Every heartbeat screamed that this was wrong and right all at once. "I can't stop noticing you," I admitted finally, voice low, trembling despite my attempt at control. "Every little thing you do, I notice it. I can't help it." Her eyes widened slightly, just enough to betray the shock beneath her calm. Then she exhaled slowly, leaning into the space between us, letting her shoulder graze mine, letting the moment stretch unbearably long. Her hand hovered near mine, not touching, yet speaking volumes. "You're reckless," she whispered, her voice closer now, so close I could feel the warmth of her breath against my cheek. "Do you even understand what you're doing?" I didn't answer. Couldn't. The truth was already lodged in the air between us, vibrating in every glance, every shallow intake of breath. My hand twitched toward her hair, almost brushing it behind her ear, and she didn't move away. Instead, she leaned just slightly, ever so slightly, toward the pull between us, and my pulse nearly stopped. The world contracted until it was only her, only me, only the fragile, electric thread connecting us. The office faded, the papers, the chairs, the humming fluorescent lights irrelevant. All that mattered was the suspended, impossible closeness. And then, as I bent ever so slightly, the urge to close the last fraction of distance consuming me, the sound of a chair scraping sharply against the floor from the doorway jolted us both. We froze, caught in the balance between surrender and restraint, our faces inches apart, breaths mingling, hands trembling just out of reach. For a heartbeat, everything hung there, desire, fear, longing. And then the moment fractured, but only just. I thought the hallway would give us a moment to breathe, but the moment betrayed me. Eleanor's phone vibrated sharply against the desk, and the look she shot me was quick, almost apologetic, though I wasn't sure for what, her interruption, or the way my pulse had already betrayed my thoughts. She answered it with a measured tone, and I caught the faintest tremor in her fingers as she held the phone. The words she spoke weren't meant for me, but I heard them anyway. "No, he can't know yet. It's not the right time." Her voice was hushed, urgent, and something in it twisted my stomach. My heartbeat accelerated as I realized someone else was part of this story. Someone who mattered to her in ways I didn't yet understand. She hung up, and for a second, she didn't meet my eyes. Her hands gripped the edge of the desk, white-knuckled, as if steadying herself against something I couldn't see. I felt the magnetic pull again, the irresistible gravity of being near her, yet now threaded with a new tension, fear, betrayal, uncertainty. "I didn't think you'd overhear," she murmured, almost a whisper, not explaining, not denying, just letting the vulnerability linger in the air. I stepped closer, but she didn't lean back. Instead, she let her shoulder graze mine as she shifted, small, almost imperceptible, yet charged. My hand itched to reach for hers, but I stayed frozen, letting the electricity crackle between us in silence. "Is someone else involved?" I asked cautiously, trying not to betray the way my chest ached at the thought. Her gaze lifted finally, sharp, searching, and I caught the fleeting flicker of fear. She hesitated, lips parting as though weighing the risk of confession. It's complicated, she said finally, voice low, roughened by something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. More than you know. I wanted to argue, to demand clarity, but the room pressed in, the air too close, the scent of her lingering perfume and the warmth radiating from her body immobilizing me. I could feel the slight tremor of her fingers brushing my arm as she shifted slightly to hand me a folder, too close, too intimate, and yet just out of reach. I shouldn't, she started, and stopped, leaving the words hanging like a fragile thread. I wanted to fill it with a confession of my own, but the weight of what I just heard made restraint feel necessary. Her nearness became unbearable in the silence, each breath of hers stirring something I hadn't named. I noticed the way her pulse fluttered at her neck, the faint quiver of her lips, the delicate line of her jaw as she tilted her head toward me. Fear and desire tangled inside me in equal measure, the risk of being wrong, the thrill of being seen. And then she moved slightly closer, closer than before, so that I could feel her warmth radiating fully against me. Her eyes held mine with a mixture of warning and invitation, a promise that whatever happened next could not be undone. I can't, I whispered, barely audible, though the tension in my chest screamed the truth. She smiled faintly, almost cruelly, leaning even closer, and in that instant, the world shrank to the space between us. A choice loomed: step back into safety, or surrender to whatever impossible pull had brought us here. I didn't move. She didn't move. And the air vibrated with the inevitability of what was coming. The office had emptied, the fluorescent lights casting long shadows across the floor. Everything else faded, the papers, the desks, the hum of the city outside, until it was just Eleanor and me, standing in the space that somehow felt too small and yet perfect. She tilted her head slightly, eyes searching mine, and I could feel her inhale, the faint scent of her perfume wrapping around me like a tether I couldn't resist. My chest ached with the weight of the moments we'd shared, the brush of her hand, the warmth of her shoulder, the long, suspended silences that had said more than words ever could. I shouldn't, she started, voice low, trembling ever so slightly, but she didn't step back. Instead, she let her hand hover near mine, a hesitant bridge that felt heavier than any decision I'd made before. I swallowed hard, my own pulse hammering in my ears. I know, I whispered, stepping closer, so close that her warmth brushed mine, our breaths mingling in the charged air. But I can't either. The distance between us shrank until it was nothing. Her eyes flickered down at my lips, then back to mine, a mixture of fear and desire that mirrored my own. Every instinct screamed to reach out, to close that final fraction of space, but reason clawed at the edges of my mind, warning me of consequences, of risks, of what everyone else might think. I'm scared, she admitted softly, voice barely audible, but it carried more weight than anything she'd ever said before. Me too, I confessed, feeling the words vibrate between us. My hand lifted, almost of its own volition, and brushed a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The touch was electric, intimate, terrifying, yet unbearably natural. She shivered ever so slightly, leaning into it without retreating. The world seemed to narrow to the steady rhythm of our breathing, the faint brush of her fingertips against my hand as she lingered, so close that I could feel the subtle rise and fall of her chest. I wanted to speak, to reassure, to beg, but words were unnecessary. The tension, the history, the longing we had both carried, it all lived in that infinitesimal distance, thick as the warm air around us. Then, finally, a decision made itself in the quiet gravity of the moment. I closed the gap, letting my forehead rest gently against hers, feeling the warmth, the steadiness, the human imperfection that made her real, that made her mine in that suspended second. She exhaled softly against me, and I felt her pulse quicken, felt the surrender in her posture, the trust, the acceptance. We didn't need to speak. Everything unspoken was understood, the risk, the longing, the forbidden thrill, and the choice we had made together. She tilted her head slightly, a faint smile brushing her lips, and I knew we had crossed the threshold. There was no turning back, no pretending it hadn't mattered. For the first time, fully, I felt seen. And for the first time, I think, she let herself be noticed, entirely, without pretense or guard. And in that moment, the world outside ceased to exist. The sunlight had softened by the time we left the office, spilling gold across the pavement. The city was still busy, rushing past us, but somehow it felt distant, irrelevant. For the first time since I'd met Eleanor, the world outside didn't press against us. It was only her and me, and that was enough. We walked slowly, side by side, neither of us speaking, letting the quiet between us carry the weight of what had finally shifted. Her hand brushed mine once, a fleeting touch that made my pulse spike. I didn't pull away. Instead, I let my fingers find hers, intertwining with a careful, tentative intimacy that felt like home. She squeezed lightly, and I knew she felt it too, the relief, the acknowledgement, the quiet joy of crossing the impossible distance between us. We stopped on a quiet street, the hum of traffic softened by the afternoon haze. Eleanor turned toward me, eyes soft but bright, as if finally unburdened. I never thought I'd let myself, she murmured, voice trembling, feel this way again. You don't have to explain, I said, brushing a loose strand of hair from her face. My fingers lingered at her jawline for just a moment, a silent promise that I would notice her, really notice her, every day if she let me. She leaned into my touch ever so slightly, and I felt the weight of her trust, the years of hesitation melting into something fragile and new. I rested my forehead against hers, letting the warmth of her skin, the softness of her breath, fill the spaces where words could not reach. I was afraid, she admitted, whispering against my lips, that it would be complicated. That it wouldn't be right. I was too, I confessed, voice low, steady. But none of that matters now. Her hand slid fully into mine, holding on with a quiet certainty that made my chest ache with relief. We stood that way for long moments, just breathing, just being, letting all the tension, the longing, and the years of careful restraint dissolve into something honest, messy, and human. Then she smiled, a real smile this time, one that crinkled the corners of her eyes and made everything else feel lighter. I pulled her close, wrapping my arms around her in a hug that was long and lingering, full of all the words we hadn't yet said but both felt. She rested her head on my shoulder, and I pressed a soft kiss to her hair, letting the moment stretch into eternity. We stayed there, just holding each other, and for the first time, age, fear, and hesitation didn't matter. There was only the warmth between us, the understanding, and the quiet certainty that we had found something worth crossing every boundary for. And when we finally stepped back, our hands still entwined, our eyes met and held each other, full of laughter, longing, and the gentle promise of more. The world could keep moving, we had found our own rhythm. Did you enjoy the story? What kind of stories would you like to hear next?